Market-based exchange rate system allowing banks to buy and sell foreign currencies with their clients and among themselves at freely negotiated rates. Additionally, the reforms eliminated rules requiring foreign exchange allocation based on waiting lists and simplified regulations governing foreign currency accounts. In this episode of Ethiopia in Focus, I will be speaking with Mamo Mihretu, Governor of the National Bank of Ethiopia and a member of the National Macroeconomic Committee, about the extensive economic reforms implemented under Ethiopia's Homegrown economic reform program. Macroeconomic reforms, progress and prospects. Today's conversation on Ethiopia in Focus with National Bank Governor Mamo Mihretu. Welcome, Mamo.
Thank you so much.
So we recall in 2019 the launch of Ethiopia's Homegrown economic reform program. And one of, or many of the aims that it intended to address was challenges like debt, inflation, and low productivity that Ethiopia at that point in time was plagued with. Data from 2019 to 2023 indicates that Ethiopia's economy registered an average GDP growth rate of 7.1%. And in the year ahead, the growth projections are estimated at 8.45%. Now we're entered the second phase of the Homegrown economic reform agenda, and this entry point really is a testament to the government's commitment and consistency in terms of ensuring economic stability. To start off our conversation, let's go back prior to 2018, and maybe you can share with us what was the economic outlook at that point in time prior to 2018.
No, thank you so much. I think it's important that we place things in context, and I think you're right that we should start by looking at the performance of the Ethiopian economy before 2018. I think that's a very, very important story because, since 2000 and up to, I would say, 2018, the Ethiopian economy has been growing. So the economic growth was robust, actually. And not just economic growth, but there was significant improvement in poverty reduction. There was significant progress in terms of human capital development, also access to basic services, including, water, electricity, and all that. So there is significant development. But the key question is, what was the source of that growth? The source of that growth was mainly public investment. So there was significant investment in public sector expenditure in Ethiopia, in roads, in railway, in sugar, and most importantly, in energy. And there is nothing wrong with that. The view of the government at that time was to get infrastructure right. And I think in that sense, the choices that were made during those periods were not necessarily wrong. But the problem is, as the government was embarking on this kind of massive public investment projects, there were significant flaws in terms of project selection, in terms of project management, and also in terms of matching the project maturation date with the debt repayment. So that was the biggest problem. And I think it's also very important to remember that the source of this growth, although it's public investment, and much of that public investment used to be financed through three important sources. The first was external financing, particularly external loan, both concessional and non-concessional loan lent to the Ethiopian government and to the public commercial companies. The second source of financing was financing by the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, the biggest bank in the country, the systemic bank in the country, providing much of the resources and the saving that it mobilized from the public and financing massive public investment. And of course, the third source of the financing was the National Bank itself. So the National Bank used to finance the budget deficit. We call it monetary financing of the budget. So these were the three important sources of the public investment that was the source of the growth since 2000 and up to 2018. Now, as I said, there was growth, but the problem is this kind of model is very difficult to sustain it. At some point, things will reach their tipping point, and that's exactly what happened in Ethiopia, and course correction was needed. So what happened was this development financing model led to significant macroeconomic instability. The model reached its limit. And the manifestation of that, I would say, are four issues, the so-called macroeconomic instability issues. The first was, as you said, the debt issue. Debt pressure was building up, and we needed to confront that. The second issue was price pressure or inflation, which again, another important factor in the macro instability story. The third, I would say, has to do with the financial sector itself. And I look at this in two ways. The first thing is, much of the credit that the economy generated used to be channeled to public commercial companies. And because of that, the private sector didn't have sufficient credit. The second part of
this, the low productivity as a result of that.
The low productivity aspect of it, the private sector, at that time, if you live in Ethiopia, everybody used to complain about shortage of access to finance issue become a binding constraint in the economy. But even importantly, because the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia was forced to lend to public commercial companies, and because these public commercial companies were not paying the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia their debt, that led to a significant vulnerability of the financial sector. It led to financial sector stability concerns. And finally, it is the problem of price level or inflation. So inflationary pressure was building up, and much of it is because of the monetary financing of the budget by the central bank. The most important issue that we faced at that time was the sustainability of the model itself. The Ethiopian public sector and the Ethiopian private sector had a significant shortage of foreign currency. Those four issues need to be properly tackled. And that was basically the genesis and the background to the Homegrown Economic Reform Program. And I think it's important for the listeners to understand that in Ethiopia, we needed a transition of the economic model where it was dependent on public investment to one that is private sector driven, to the one that supports productive growth. That transition is needed, and that transition was needed out of necessity because the old model was not sustainable, but also out of choice because we need to embrace a new source of growth in the economy, including the productive sectors.
So we come to 2018, and 2018 is a turning point politically, economically. A lot of the pressures that were also somehow related to economic push factors have precipitated a change of administration. Enter Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and from the beginning, he had always talked about the high levels of debt that had been inherited. And then secondly, the commitment not to have this become a generational thing. Like at some point in time, the course correction that you mentioned is to ensure that future generations are not going to continue inheriting this debt as well. So let's get into the course correction. 2018, introduction of the Homegrown Economic Reform Agenda, implementation started in 2019. What have been the achievements out of that, and what changes have transpired as a result of this agenda?
No, absolutely. As it happened, when Prime Minister Abiy came into political power, this was the legacy that we inherited. We faced, this significant and severe macroeconomic challenge that we needed to confront and address. And at that time, I was at the office of the Prime Minister, and I was part of the team that developed and crafted the Homegrown Economic Reform Program. And I remember very clearly and vividly the conversation that we had at that time. So those four issues, if they're not properly addressed, it will lead to, I would say, a disaster to the Ethiopian economy. So we needed to address them. So the Homegrown Economic Reform Program essentially was developed to address these four macroeconomic challenges on one hand, and we call them a macro set of issues. The second thing is we also want to address so-called structural issues. By structural, I'm talking about improving the investment climate in Ethiopia, creating a much more competitive environment for the private sector to flourish in Ethiopia, to attract more foreign direct investment in the country, reform in the energy sector, reform in the telecom sector. This was part of the structural reform that we developed at that time. And the third element of the Homegrown Economic Reform Program was the so-called sectoral reforms. At that time, we had to identify, key source of growth for the Ethiopian economy. And we identified agriculture to be one of it. Second was ICT. Third, we looked at tourism. Fourth was mining. And finally, manufacturing. So these sectors were identified. So the Homegrown Economic Reform Program, the first phase of the Homegrown Economic Reform Program has three elements. the macro reform program, where we try to tackle the macro instability issues. We had a structural element to it, where we try to address policy, regulatory, administrative issues that hinder productivity growth in Ethiopia. And the third is sectoral issues, where we want to stimulate growth, new source of growth in the Ethiopian economy. So that's exactly what we did. We developed the Homegrown Economic Reform Program. There was wider consultation within the government, among the public, and we start implementing it. And of course, immediately after the implementation of the program, all sorts of things happened, both in Ethiopia and also outside of Ethiopia, which I'm more than happy to talk about.
This is what you're referring to is global shocks, economically as well, perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on Ethiopia. I think internally with climate change, we had also have our own bouts of droughts, locust infestation were some of the things that we had to deal with, including an internal conflict. So related to that, what was some of the turning points that had to be addressed at that point in time?
I remember, when we launched the first Homegrown Economic Reform Program, if I'm not wrong, it was around August, September 2019. And the program was off to a good start. It was widely supported by the international community as well. There was an accompanying support program by IMF and also a program by the World Bank, and there was a lot of interest from international development partners. So it started excellently, and there was significant progress in the beginning. And then, lo and behold, early 2020, COVID happened. And you know the story after that. And late 2020, there was a tragic domestic civil conflict in Ethiopia. And then followed that, there was a disruption of global supply chain, as you know. And in 2022, the conflict in Ukraine happened. This cocktail of shocks, one shock after another, put a heavy toll on the Ethiopian economy in so many ways. It affected economic activity. It led to a significant increase in price level, inflation particularly. It affected balance of payment outturns. It affected budgetary expenditures. So the impact of these shocks on the Ethiopian economy was so significant. Just to give you an example, the economic reform program itself was supposed to increase tax revenue, for example, and we call it fiscal consolidation. The fiscal consolidation element essentially will force you to reduce budgetary spendings, but because of this additional demand that was generated because of COVID and because of the conflict, the budgetary expenditure had to increase. Our economic reform goal was to bring about monetary restraint, but because of significant budgetary need, the central bank financing of the budget has dramatically increased. And we also wanted to increase our reserve, so-called balance of payment issue. That was not possible simply because international finance flow, international support from our development partners was significantly cut because of the conflict. So yes, the Homegrown Economic Reform Program was off to a good start, but because of these shocks, some of the elements of the program were not properly implemented. But having said that, despite this challenge, despite this complex challenge, the core element of the Homegrown Economic Reform Program was implemented in the midst of conflict, in the midst of international crisis. We were able to achieve so much important goals. For example, one of the main problems that we faced before the reform program was our external loan to GDP was close to 32%. We were able to reduce it significantly because we stopped taking non-concessional loan. We were able to implement difficult subsidy elimination, removal in key sectors, in sugar, in wheat, in oil, fuel, petroleum. All that was achieved in the midst of these challenging circumstances. We conceptualized and introduced a number of market-friendly institutions. A case in point, we established a capital market authority. We are in the process of setting up the Ethiopian Security Exchange. We introduced the Ethiopian Investment Holdings, our sovereign wealth fund, to manage our public commercial companies efficiently. So yes, after the introduction of the Homegrown Economic Reform Program, we faced complex challenges, but despite that complexity, despite the series of shocks, we were able to focus, maintain, and robustly and aggressively pursue the core elements of the Homegrown economic reform program. And that's why we managed to continue with the high growth that we used to register in the past.
And I think this is testament to what the Prime Minister often shares about Ethiopia's economy being resilient. Are there any other manifestations that you'd like to share in terms of the resilience of the economy over the past few years?
Well, I think, so many, a number of examples come to mind. For example, we look at what has been done in the agricultural sector. We were confronted with drought. I remember at that time, around 2022. And despite that, there was a significant redoubling of effort to improve agricultural productivity, the cluster farming, the wheat self-sufficiency drive was part of an effort to be self-sufficient and to be food secure. And this is an example of, the resilience of the Ethiopian economy. It's amazing how resilient the Ethiopian economy is. It's for us, even for people who are actually involved in this issue on the day-to-day basis. We were able to introduce a number of institutions, a number of reforms without external support in the middle of conflict, in the middle of a war. And I remember when war was raging in the north part of the country, members of the macro committee were visiting farms in Amhara region. So again, this effort, not only to just focus on one thing, but to try to address multiple things at the same time, is part of the policy-making environment in Ethiopia. And it also goes to show the resilience of the country itself.
One of the clear differences in terms of the economic management, as you had indicated several factors before, is also the introduction and the focus on a private sector-led economy. Can you say a little bit more about that and how the Homegrown Economic Reform Agenda, the first one, has facilitated and enabled that to take place?
In so many ways. I think one of the things that we realize as we review the growth performance of the past years before the current administration came into political power was the dependency on public investment. Now, mobilizing public resources for development is not wrong. You have to use all the means that are available to achieve economic growth and to sustain the economic growth. But the problem is it overly focuses on the role and the participation of the public sector. And a rebalancing was needed. We need to use and capitalize on the promise and the potential and participation of the private sector. And when you ask why the private sector was not significantly engaged in economic activities, you find that most of it's because there was no access to finance, access to credit. It's a big part of it. There was shortage of foreign currency, and it's because the business environment was not competitive in Ethiopia. And we took several measures to address that. On access to finance, much of the credits that's available in the economy is being channeled to the private sector. I remember when this administration started work, much of the credit, close to 70% of the credit that the banks generate used to go to the public sector. Now, close to 80% of new credit goes to the private sector because we want to stimulate private sector. Why? Because if the private sector is active, then they can generate jobs. They can generate good, better jobs for the youth. The second thing is we also want to address the foreign currency shortage for the private sector. I will come back to that point. The reform that we took recently is a decisive measure in that regard. But the third thing that this government did was it created an interministerial steering committee to address policy, regulatory, and administrative barriers, issues that hinder the productivity of the private sector. Remember, the initiative you yourself participated in terms of improving the doing business environment in Ethiopia. At that time, this initiative used to be coordinated by the Ethiopian Investment Commission. All these efforts are geared towards increasing the role and the participation of the private sector. If the private sector is active, then we'll be able to sustain the economic growth that we've started.
So let's go a little bit, not necessarily backward, but let's reflect in terms of the opening up that has transpired, liberalization of the economy. Because what we recall is prior to 2018, the economy might not have been that conducive for foreign direct investments. And in what ways has the Homegrown economic reform agenda supported or facilitated the opening up for foreign direct investment inflows?
Yeah, I mean, the Homegrown economic reform program, the structural reform element of it, the essence of it is not just improving the investment climate in Ethiopia, but also wanted to open up the Ethiopian economy to foreign direct investment. And in that sense, it was a historic step. I say historic because sectors that were closed to foreign direct investment were opened up at that time. A good example is the telecom sector. Everybody remembers that. At that time, again, for people who now are used to, two telecom operators in the country, this might be seen as normal now. Mm-hmm. But in the 2 decades preceding this new administration, opening up of the telecom sector was, and is not something that we can not only open up the sector, but you cannot even debate it. Nobody can even mention it. It's a no-go area. But the Homegrown economic reform program, one of the achievements of that will be to open up the Ethiopian telecom sector to foreign direct competition, which, by the way, made Ethio Telecom itself much more competitive. So I think subjecting industries to competition is a good and right policy. But don't get me wrong. When I talk about opening up of the economy and liberalization of the economy, I'm not talking about deregulating the economy. The two concepts are completely different. Opening up is opening up a sector for competition, whether it's domestic or foreign, while regulating is the inherent right of the government. So when you open up a sector, we at the same time regulate it. So opening up doesn't mean deregulation. So there were a number of steps that we took, opening up of the logistics sector progressively, reviewing and considering at that time to open up the financial sector, establishing the Ethiopian capital market and allowing the private sector to play an important role in deepening the capital market in Ethiopia, including opening up foreign investment banks. So a number of steps that we took to open up the Ethiopian economy to foreign competition. This is important. This is important because we want to make the Ethiopian economy dynamic. If the economy is dynamic, if the economy is open to new skills, to technology, to know-how, to additional competition, then it will be in a better place to create more jobs and better jobs for the growing use of the country. Okay,
so let's fast forward and come to July 2024, where we've taken unprecedented measures in terms of the second set or the second phase of the Homegrown economic reform agenda. By that point in time, Ethiopia has become the largest economy in East Africa. Now, with the measures that have been introduced as part of the second Homegrown economic reform agenda, what are the low-hanging fruits gained so far? And maybe if you could also explore a little bit about what that entailed.
I think it's important to step back and appreciate the magnitude of what was being done as part of Homegrown Economic Reform Program 2, Phase 2. What we did under Phase 2 is to deepen and broaden the reform program that we started under Phase 1. And what we achieved is truly historic. It was historic, it was bold, it was comprehensive, and it's also coordinated. I say it was historic because we've attempted to tackle issues and policies that have not been touched in Ethiopia for the last 50 years. It was bold because we tried to address it in a completely different way. It was comprehensive and coordinated. It's because we're not just looking at one issue. We're looking at multiple issues, and there was a deep coherence and consistency among different initiatives and among different government agencies. It was not a reform program that was taken by one government agency. It was a reform program was taken by the whole government. There's a whole of government approach to it. Because it was coordinated, the reform program that we embarked on under Homegrown Economic Reform Program truly represents a historic reset of the Ethiopian economy, a transformative moment for the Ethiopian economy into one that's open, FDI friendly, and market-based. To just be,
so
I want to expand on that, and I want to talk about some of the elements of this reform program. I think the first thing that we did was to fundamentally reform the foreign currency regime in the country. As you know, in the past, in this country, the rate, the foreign currency rate, was determined by the central bank by regulation. And one of the key reforms that we took was to fundamentally shift to a market-based exchange rate regime instead of adopting the old controlled model. The reason for this is because, number one, we want to boost foreign currency inflow into the economy. But number two, we also want to address the foreign currency shortage that businesses face in Ethiopia. Those were the fundamental drivers of the reform. The FX reform essentially moved the regime to a market-based determination of the exchange rate. That was the first element of it. The other element of it is we rationalized, we consolidated the close to 87 different foreign currency regulations that the central bank used to have into one single FX regulation. We called it the Green Book.
That's a huge milestone.
It's a huge milestone. It's not just a market determination of the exchange rate, but also a regulatory reform, because instead of 87 regulations, we now have one regulation, Green Book, accessible to everyone. Anybody can read it and understand it. And this was a fundamental reform on the FX regime. The second thing is we modernized the monetary policy regime in Ethiopia. I don't want to be too technical here, but the monetary policies that the central bank used to implement in the past used to be focused on quantity. Now we moved to interest-based monetary policy. The reason why we want to modernize the monetary policy is because we want to control inflation better. So we introduced a new market infrastructure in the Ethiopian economy. For example, there is a central bank policy rate that we introduced for the first time. We created an interbank money market. We invested in the money market infrastructure. We started open market operations. All sorts of new financial infrastructure, financial policies were introduced as a part of modernization of the monetary policy. The third thing is we want to mobilize revenue for the government that will help meet our development needs. So so-called fiscal consolidation, revenue-based fiscal consolidation, with the objective of increasing the government's tax revenue by 4% in the next 4 years. Time was another important step that we took. And the fourth and the final part of this economic reform program was we wanted to address the legacy debt that CB had when it comes to public commercial companies. That had to be tackled through innovative ways. So we recapitalized the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, and a big part of the debt was shifted to the treasury, to the government, and we once again made the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia healthy and stable. Because if the financial sector is not stable, it will have an important implication on the broader economy. So stability of the financial sector is an important economic agenda. So taken together, these reforms, as I said, truly represent an important transformative moment for the Ethiopian economy. It will unleash productivity. It will address, challenges that hinder growth and productivity in the Ethiopian economy. And the early results showed that. Let me just give you a few examples.
The low-hanging fruits.
The early results. For example, people talk about the foreign currency reform, but I will tell you this. After we took that reform initiative, if you look at the result now, the foreign currency inflow in Ethiopia has been dramatically increasing. The central bank reserve and the reserve at the banking sector has literally doubled. If you talk to people now, the private sector participants, access to foreign currency is not a problem that it used to be. I mean, only recently I had an engagement with the European business community. None of them raised access to foreign currency as a binding constraint to the Ethiopian economy. A number of foreign companies were able to repatriate their income, their profits outside of Ethiopia for the first time in a long years. Many of them. Banks were able to, close their what they call net open position, which is their past liability successfully. Remittance has significantly increased. Export has significantly increased. I will just give you an example. The National Bank, for example, is in charge of selling gold, exporting gold in Ethiopia. Last year, for the whole year, the foreign currency earning for gold was about $255 million. This year, within 4 months of the reform, we took the reform on July 29. I remember that, very, very clearly. July 29, in the last 4 months' time, the export volume for gold has reached almost $1 billion.
So, no, that is quite a huge milestone. Maybe you could expand a little bit on that, on what it actually means.
Well, it means that, again, the objective of the reform program is being met. One of the, clear objectives of the reform program was to try to increase export receipt, to increase, FX influence the economy. And if remittance is growing, if export is growing, then private sector businesses will be able to get the foreign currency that they need to increase their productivity. Think of it in terms of the manufacturing sector. I would say if you talk to an owner of a manufacturing plant in Ethiopia, in the past, they used to tell you that they operate literally at half their capacity. If you ask the reason, most of them will tell you that it's because they don't have the inputs that they need, and they don't have the inputs that they need is because of shortage of foreign currency. So if you address the foreign currency needs of private businesses, then that will do wonders to the productivity of the productive sectors in the economy.
And in terms of also provision of products to the market, because the question that I had wanted to ask you in terms of the criticisms that need to be addressed thoroughly is, in the short term, are there certain shocks that we have to sacrifice for those long-term gains?
There is. The reform anticipates all of that. This is, as I said, it's a well thought out, well coordinated, carefully planned reform program. It took us almost 3 months to carry out this reform. And by the way, we were supported by the International Monetary Fund. It's a 4 years program. It's supported by IMF, supported by the World Bank, to really mitigate the impact of the reform. So people talk about, for example, the price impact of the reform, the inflationary impact of the reform. And we thought about that very, very carefully. And the government is taking a number of steps in that regard. I think number one, we need to appreciate to what extent that is a problem. Because in Ethiopia, much of the goods in the consumer basket are goods that are domestically produced. And import constitutes close to 10% of the CPI index. The second thing is, much of the private sector's import of these goods used to be handled at the parallel market. So by moving towards a market-based exchange rate regime, we are not doing anything new. Essentially, we were recognizing reality as it were. But the third thing is, for low-income households, the government is taking a number of steps. For example, we are increasing salary. We are expanding the social safety net program. We are subsidizing fuel and fertilizer. All this is to address the potential negative impact of the reform. I think overall, by any measure, this reform program was well planned, well executed, clearly communicated. Unlike other countries, there is a clear coordination between the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities. And we did it in a context where monetary policy was prudent. Because if monetary policy is not prudent, it's very difficult to support exchange rate reform outcomes. And also it's very difficult to address inflationary pressure. So the three factors were coordinated: the monetary policy, exchange rate, and fiscal policy were clearly coordinated, and that I believe will create the condition for the Ethiopian economy to grow in a sustainable fashion in the years ahead.
Okay, so moving ahead or moving forward, what are the key priorities for the Ethiopian economy over the next few years? What should we expect?
I think the objective of the reform program is to pursue a prudent macroeconomic policy. So stability is an important investment. Stability is an important precondition. Second thing is we want to support and expand the role and the participation of the private sector. And third thing that I would say is we want to make sure that Ethiopia's economic growth is job creating, and that the export sector is fully supported, and that our debt is on sustainable footing. So these are important investments. And I think the fundamentals are there. If you look at the outlook for the next couple of years, I think I can talk about on the macro stability front. For example, our prudent monetary policy will significantly reduce inflation in the years ahead. So our expectation is next year, inflation will be in sort of high single digit. And that is partly because of the prudent monetary policies that we are currently implementing, and partly because of the supply side measures that the government is taking, including increasing the productivity of agriculture. So this will help us stabilize price of foods. So on the macro front, I think there will be significant progress. On the revenue mobilization front to support development needs of the government, the start of the work reform program is showing a promising result in that regard. We also have a task of deepening the FX market and stabilizing the FS market. In that regard, the progress is quite good. And if you look at, for example, the premium between the parallel market and the official market, before the reform, it was about 100%. Now it is less than 7%. It literally collapsed. So we want to maintain this. We want to increase remittance flow. We want to support private sector activities in that regard. On the growth outlook, it's also promising for the year ahead. For example, agricultural productivity will increase because of several new initiatives that the government is taking. Mining will become an important contributor to the Ethiopian growth story. Of course, the Ethiopian service sector has always been growing. The logistics sector, the aviation sector, the tourism sector are important contributors. So both on the macro stability front, on the growth outlook front, we'll see important and positive outcomes in the year ahead.
So as we wrap up, Mamo, as a member of the Macroeconomic Committee and in your role as Governor of the National Bank of Ethiopia, what assurances and hopes do you have that make you feel we're doing it right? So we're on the right track.
I think, I am very, very bullish about our prospects for a number of reasons. Number one, our investment in agriculture and other productive sectors will bear fruit. It will stabilize domestic food price, but will also support other related sectors, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's the export sector, will be supported by the positive steps that we're taking in the agricultural sector. Second thing that I would say is the reform measures that we're taking, for example, opening up the logistics sector, opening up the banking sector, the telecom sector, the energy sector, retail sector, would attract
to foreign direct investments.
Exactly, would attract more private capital in the economy that will further drive the Ethiopian economy. Third thing that I would say is Ethiopia is a large country. It's one of the biggest countries in the African continent. What that means is it will always be in the radar of foreign direct investors. It will always attract private capital in the economy because people want to take advantage of that. Another thing is we also benefit from the demographic transition. We have a youth that's ready to work. So always, there is labor that will support the economic growth in Ethiopia. Another very, very important investment is the investment in clean energy. A country that's a leader in clean energy will be the leader in the world. So we invested significantly in hydro energy, in clean energy. Close to 99% of our energy source is clean. And this fundamental structural factor, the demography and our investment in clean energy, will propel Ethiopian economic growth so long as our macro environment is stable. And I can tell you, this is something that's also verified and supported by independent commentators, and including IMF. If you look at IMF's projection, their projection is the Ethiopian economy in the next 4 years will maintain the 8% growth. FDI will reach close to 6 billion annually. Our debt to GDP ratio will reach about 30%, and that's both domestic and external. External will be close to 10%. Our international reserve in the next 3-4 years will reach $10 billion. So yes, the economy will grow, the economy will generate jobs, and the economy will also be an example to the rest of Africa.
We're on the right track.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mamo. What are you most hopeful about the social inclusion agenda and initiatives that are taking place in Ethiopia?
For me, it's the education sector, seeing kids at rural areas who were deprived of having access to such education, early childhood development initiatives. So that really makes me hopeful. I see Ethiopia being really at its rightful position when those kids grow and really take the responsibility of leading this country. And for me, it's the education sector.